Hey friends, it was good to see many of you at our first in-person Meeting House Ottawa gathering yesterday. It was really good to see some faces in, as somebody said yesterday, in 3D. But we also recognize that not everybody's ready to get back together in person. We also know that yesterday all of the in-person spaces in our service had filled up by like Tuesday night for registration. So not everybody who wanted to be there could be there. And we don't want to create this sense that that the in-person gathering is the most important thing, and that if you're watching the live stream at home or not able to be there at the in-person gathering, that somehow you're missing out. That's not the case at all. We want the in-person gathering to be sort of a companion to what happens on the live stream, and whether you do one or you do both, you're going to be tracking along the same way, and that they kind of go hand in hand in the same way that home church and our Sunday gatherings have often went together at home church and the live stream, etc. So what we do want to do is occasionally to kind of give a sense of what happened in the room for the in-person gatherings. Instead of recording that and getting grainy cell phone footage or lower quality footage of an in-person experience, we're going to try and bring some of the things that we do occasionally from the in-person gatherings to an online space like this, so that if you weren't there, you're able to engage as well. And so yesterday, one of the things that happened is I did a short teaching, and so I figured I would replicate that here for you, and we'd be able to dialogue about it here in these online spaces, Instagram, Facebook, etc. So would love to hear your comments in the comments below and continue to have a conversation that way. So let's think about this. As I said, it was really good to see people in person yesterday. And I know we've often been seeing each other online. You see people through Zoom, or you see their photos that they post on social media. But research shows that seeing somebody digitally is not the same as seeing them in person. Our bodies, they see, okay, I see that person that I know, I recognize my friend, but our brains have to sort of differentiate and realize, but that person is not actually physically here. My initial thought is, oh, it's my friend, they're here, and I realize that they're actually not physically in the same space as my body. And that creates a bit of tension in your brain to process all of that. And that's one of the reasons why we often find digital interactions a little bit more tiring than in-person interactions. Though, as I discovered when I woke up this morning, those in-person interactions these days, because we're a little bit out of the habit, can be also draining. I felt myself a little bit tired when I got home last night and this morning, and you're like, oh wow, being with that amount of people that's a muscle I haven't worked as much lately, and so I also was tired. But there's this dissonance that comes from, I see you, but but you're not really here. And I think that gets at something where, and I say this a lot in when I talk, but I think for me it probably says a lot about me. But one of the most fundamental things, or maybe the most fundamental thing that we long for as human beings, is to be seen, to be known for who we truly are and loved anyways. To be able to be our full, authentic selves and still be accepted and still have a sense of belonging. And so when we talk in this series that we're doing at the Meeting House, Welcome Home, home is not a place. Home is wherever you have that sense of belonging, of this is a place where I am seen for who I am truly known, and I am loved anyways. I think that's what we long for. And so as I think about our Meeting House Ottawa community, I want us to be a community that sees other people for who they truly are and loves them anyways. I know the Meeting House has been that for me in my experience. It was probably about 10 years ago now that a friend of mine recommended that I listen to a podcast, and that podcast led me to listening to the Meeting House podcast. And I was at a point in my life where I'd grown up in the church, I'd worked in a church. By that point, I wasn't working in church anymore. I was selling furniture, which means I wasn't going to church because I was working on Sundays. And I was, for lack of a better term, probably deconstructing my faith a little bit. I had a lot of questions. I was quite cynical. None of that's completely changed, 10 years later, but I'm in a different place in my journey. But I I was really just kind of trying to figure out, like, where do I fit? What do I really believe about God? I had a sort of a fundamentalist sort of upbringing in the church. And so there was a lot of baggage that I was carrying, and I didn't really have a clear sense of things. And so I was pushing back against a lot, questioning a lot, just trying to figure it out. I didn't know where I belonged, and I hadn't always had the experience that when I was in church that I could be seen and that I could be known for who I truly was and be loved. And so I ended up listening to the Meeting House podcast, and that was a meaningful thing for me because it was like, I felt like, here's other people who are thinking similar to what I'm thinking, or, this feels like, like when you find a group of people and you're like, I've always thought I was a little bit alone in this, and now I've discovered another group of people who are actually like this. This is my tribe. This is my community. And, I didn't immediately join the Meeting House or anything like that, but I was like, here's other people who are thinking and tracking along in the same ways I am. And I began to feel less alone in the world because I knew that the Meeting House existed and that I was a part of this community. And of course, it was like not for another 8 years later that I actually came to a Meeting House service because I started working in the Meeting House. But I'd been tracking with Meeting House for a long time and felt like, that's a place where I can belong, where I can be seen. Those are other people who are thinking of me. And I want our church community, our Meeting House auto community, to do that for people, to be a place where they can come and say, this is what I've been longing for. This is what I've been looking for. This is a place where I can fit. And so I'm going to look at a passage in Scripture for a second, a story that maybe helps illustrate this a little bit and helps us to think about how we can be a community that cares for others by seeing them, by truly knowing them, and allowing them to be themselves and be loved and to belong. And so we're going to look at Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. I'm going to read it, and then we're going to unpack it just a little bit. So Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. It's the story about Zacchaeus. If you grew up in church, you know that Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. And if you didn't grow up in the church, you're like, that is probably the weirdest thing I've ever heard. I don't know what's happening right now. It just is. There's a whole song. I'm not going to sing it, but Zacchaeus, he's a tiny guy, a wee little man. So Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." So there's 3 sort of perspectives, 3 sort of characters in the story that I want us to think about for a moment. The first is Zacchaeus. And we read here in the text that he was a chief tax collector. Now we know from history that at that time, when Jesus was walking the earth, he lived in Israel. And Israel was under Roman occupation. So Jesus was a Jew, but he lived in occupied territory. The Romans were in charge. So Zacchaeus would have also been a Jew, but he was collecting taxes. And of course, he was collecting taxes for the Romans. So he would have been seen as a traitor, somebody who got wealthy by selling out his fellow countrymen. Because he took the side of the Romans. He was collecting taxes for the Romans and making a profit off of it. He's a very wealthy man. This was a lucrative decision for him. But of course, all his fellow Jews would have hated him. They would have seen him as a traitor, an outcast, not a good Jew in any way. So he would have been a pariah in his community. But of course, Zacchaeus would not have fit in with the Romans either, because he was a Jew, and Jews, whether they collect taxes for Rome or not, were not Romans. They were not seen as equal. They weren't the same. He was always going to be a Jew. So he didn't fit in with the Jews. He didn't fit in with the Romans. Zacchaeus is a man who doesn't have a space where he can belong. Bruxy in this Welcome Home series has been talking a lot about the idea of loneliness. And I would imagine Zacchaeus felt a lot of loneliness because, he doesn't have a place to fit. And I think coupled with that, there's this really interesting thing that he talks about how he was short. He was a wee little man, kind of easy to overlook. And people not really, when somebody's short, you don't always see them. You can just sort of scan by them and you don't always see them. And small, Zacchaeus probably felt small, almost invisible, I think, in a way. Because, again, he didn't fit anywhere, and people basically saw him not so much as a person, but as a label. So to the Jews, he was a tax collector. That was his identity. He was a tax collector. Not Zacchaeus, he was Zacchaeus the tax collector. And to the Romans would have seen him primarily as a Jew. And so nobody really sees Zacchaeus for who he is. They see him for the labels that he wears. And so in many ways, they can't see him because he's invisible, because he's hidden behind the labels. And so often we label people and we don't really see them for who they are, because the labels, we just see the labels. And we say, oh, well, that person can't belong with us because he doesn't have the right label. They don't belong here because their label is different than ours. And so our labels can make people invisible and unseen. And I think there's a sense of loneliness that comes when other people don't see us for who we really are, but they just see us for what they label us as, or what we are often labeled as. And so Zacchaeus, there's a sense of desperation in this text, that he believes that, seeing Jesus will help in some way. It might help with his loneliness, might help with his life. He has this sense that Jesus might be who he's looking for, or what he's looking for, that sense of belonging might be there. Zacchaeus is what we would call in meeting house lingo, somebody who's spiritually curious. He's looking for something more. I mean, we're all spiritually curious, but he's longing for something. And so Zacchaeus is the first person in this story. The second group of people is the crowd. And I want us to think about the crowd for a second, because the crowd has really good motivations here. They want to go and see Jesus. They want to connect with Jesus. The crowd is there to hear his teachings, to experience what it is to be with him, to perhaps see a miracle. And all of that's good. All of that is good. But it's really interesting, right, that in their focus on wanting to see Jesus personally, to connect with him, that they want an experience with Jesus, that as a crowd, they end up blocking Zacchaeus from being able to connect with Jesus. Zacchaeus can't access Jesus because the crowd is in the way. A couple weeks ago, Bruxy talked about in the teaching how we often think that what God wants from us is our worship vertically back to him in response to the love that he gives us. That, what we need to do is we need to respond to God. And that ultimately, our relationship with God is between him and me. It's between us, and that's what we focus on, is how is my relationship with Jesus? How is my relationship with God? And that becomes the primary thing we think about. When in fact, real worship, what God is looking for, is for us to receive the love that God has for us, and then to love others in return. That true worship is to take that and share that love horizontally, not to return it vertically. And I think, in a way, what's happening in this text is the crowd wants to experience this vertically. They want to connect with Jesus. That's the primary thing. And in doing so, they miss Zacchaeus and his need and his desire to access Jesus, and they actually get in the way. They become a hindrance to Zacchaeus' ability to connect with Jesus. And of course, that's interesting because in the crowd's desire to connect with Jesus, they end up missing the person that Jesus seems most interested in the story. They miss Zacchaeus. They miss the marginalized person, the person who they've labeled, the person who doesn't fit anywhere. And in their rush to gather around Jesus, they actually get in the way of what Jesus cares about the most, the person Jesus cares about. And they prevent Zacchaeus from connecting with Jesus. And I think often maybe we can get our priorities backwards. I was thinking about that as we were gathering yesterday. It was so good to be in a room together. But if the getting in a room together to experience community together and to experience Jesus together is the purpose of what we do as a church, then we are going to miss out on perhaps what Jesus cares about the most, which is the least, the marginalized, the lost, the hurting, the broken, the people who are overlooked, the people who don't belong, the people who aren't seen. And so if our gatherings are just about, well, I need to go, I've missed this so much, I've missed being in a place where musical worship happens, I've missed being in a place to hear teaching, I've missed seeing people, and this will be so good for me, then I think we miss out on what Jesus is actually really calling us to do. Our gatherings must be about, well, we come together so that we can go out. We gather so we can go. And that our gatherings should point us, should open our eyes and our hearts to better see and care for the people who are longing to belong, who are longing to feel loved, who are longing to feel seen. And so it's just, I think in this text, a little bit of a caution that sometimes something that is good is not the best thing. Sometimes we can get so focused on ourselves and our relationship with God that we miss what Jesus is calling us to do and the people that Jesus is calling us to care about and the work that he's calling us to do as a church. And so I just pray that we would continue to stay open and that would be our greatest focus, is that we would not be overlooking the Zacchaeuses in our lives, those who are marginalized, those who are overlooked, those who don't belong, but that we would have eyes to see them and our hearts to connect with them. And ultimately that we'd be more like Jesus. And Jesus is the third person in this story. And Jesus is not distracted by the crowd, but Jesus sees through the crowd, above the crowd, to see Zacchaeus. And it says that Jesus looks up at Zacchaeus. And I think that's such a fun phrasing, right? He looked up and he sees Zacchaeus. Where everyone else has overlooked Zacchaeus, Jesus looks up. And so often Zacchaeus has been looked down upon by others. And in this moment, Jesus looks up and sees him. I think that's interesting. And Jesus does, and so Jesus sees Zacchaeus, and he calls him by name. He doesn't call him a tax collector. He doesn't call him Jew. He doesn't call him a label. He calls him by name. He says Zacchaeus. And then Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house. Sometimes when we reach out to people, we want to bring them into our sphere. We want to connect with them, and so we bring them in. And that's good. But sometimes we have to get out of our comfort zone, and it's better for us to move towards other people than to try and draw them in towards us. So Jesus invites himself into Zacchaeus' home and says, I want to be a part of your life. And I think there's often a sense in which we want to invite people to be a part of our lives and come to our services, come to our gatherings, come to our experience. And Jesus says, I would like to go to your house. And I think more often than not, we need to move towards people. That needs to be the direction that we need to be headed. And of course, I think it's interesting that Jesus doesn't put any requirements on Zacchaeus before Jesus will have dinner at his house. He doesn't say, you need to quit being a tax collector, you need to be more generous, you need to give money away, you need to stop cheating people, you need to make restitution before I will have dinner at your house. He doesn't do that. He enters into relationship with Zacchaeus first, and then it's out of that relationship that then Zacchaeus responds with, oh, and now I'm going to respond with generosity. I'm going to respond with making restitution for wrongs that I've done. I'm going to be transformed through relationship, not transformed to relationship. We often will say, I will have a relationship with people if they transform first. And Jesus says, I will have a relationship with you, and then through the relationship, through the being seen, through the being known, through the being loved for who you are, then transformation happens. And so, of course, I think all of us have been all three of these people in the story. We can identify with Zacchaeus. There have been moments in our lives where we have felt like people only see us by our labels and that we are overlooked. And we long for a place to belong, long for a place to be seen, to truly be known, truly loved. I think there have been many times where I've been a part of the crowd and I've just been so focused on myself and my relationship with Jesus and wanting an experience and wanting to connect in that way that I've missed out on what my true calling as a follower of Jesus, what Jesus' true heart is about, which is to love others as I love myself, to see those who go unseen, to reach out and to move towards those that are mocked and belittled and marginalized in our society. And hopefully there are times where I can identify with Jesus and move towards what Jesus models in the story, which is seeing people who are marginalized in labels and seeing past those labels and seeing people for who they really are and getting to know them and moving towards them and entering into relationship, not with an agenda in mind, but just for relationship, to know them, to experience them, to learn from them. And in the process, not just to change them, but in the process, actually, that both of us will be transformed as the relationship develops and as we grow closer together. And so as a Meeting House Ottawa community, I just pray that we would move towards being like Jesus, as we see in this story, that we would move towards others, that we would have eyes to see, that in this season of regathering, that our hearts would be like, would celebrate the fact that we can get together, but that we would not lose sight of what's most important is what Jesus models for us here. And that is loving others. And so I pray that our gatherings, our times together, our home churches, our conversations in the chat, on social media, all the different places that we connect together, that those would encourage us and they would equip us for the purpose of seeing others, of seeing each other as a community and beginning to really know each other. Brex was talking about, a couple weeks ago about, leaning in and being really curious. And as we do that, loving one another and making space for us to belong. I think when that happens, the series has been titled Welcome Home. And I think that's when that happens. Then we feel like, oh, okay, this is home. This is where I belong. And we want the Meeting House Ottawa to be a place where people feel at home, where we belong. And I think the Zacchaeus story gives us a sense of what we might need to do to get there. Thinking of you, praying for you. If you'd like to be in the room for our next gathering on October the 10th, the link is in our bio on Instagram, or if you're watching this on Facebook, the link is in the comments below. To register, registration last week filled up by about Tuesday night, so I wouldn't leave it too long if you're hoping to be in the room. And looking forward to thinking about themes of Thanksgiving and gratitude this weekend as we gather together, but also reflecting on how we can do that within some of the more the painful seasons of life and in the circumstances that we can encounter of loss and grief and hardship. And so trying to balance those two things together this coming Sunday. So hope to see you there. If not there, then hopefully I'll see you online as well. Take care.